I am Stephen Hardin. I'm a professor of history at McMurray University in Abilene. And I am delighted to see you here today because, boy, howdy, do we have a treat for you this afternoon. You can't hear me? That's a first. That's a first. Well, did anybody not hear that I'm Steve Hardin? Okay, because that's important. That's really, really important. And delighted that you're all here. And we have three truly expert speakers. Ladies first. Gordon Jennings was a farmer from Bastrop who came into this town, into the Alamo. And on March 6th, he died there. But before he did that, he had a whole mess of kids. And I'm so glad he did, because if he hadn't, we wouldn't have Lee Spencer White. And she is truly a delight and a treasure. And she is also, if any of you know Lee, is an absolute dynamo. She is a force of nature. She not only organized the Alamo Descendants Organization, but Lee, has there ever been another president of that organization? No. And as long as Lee is around, I doubt anyone would even dare. And if that were not enough, she and her co-author, Ron Jackson, have written a truly remarkable book about Joe, Travis's body servant, which, people are always saying, well, is there anything you could possibly know about the Alamo? Well, if you say that, read Lee and Ron's book. There is just a gold mine of new information in that book. My friend Bruce Winders and I share a special bond. Not only do we both have our PhDs from TCU, but we share a mentor in Grady McQuinney. And those of you who I hope remember Dr. McQuinney, again, he's another force of nature. But Bruce is the historian curator at the Alamo. And future generations who are studying the institutional history of the Alamo will mark before Bruce and after Bruce. Because Bruce has, and I say this with no hyperbole whatsoever, and I'm going to embarrass him, but he has transformed that place. I've been going to the Alamo all of my adult life, and I think I went there the first time when I was 3. And the changes, the improvements that have been wrought as a direct result of this man are nothing less than transformational. And he doesn't get nearly enough credit for that. And, I'm going to try to fix that. Now, my friend Jim Crisp. Jim and I have been friends for more years than either one of us would like to admit. Although he has spent a lot of time outside of the state, Jim is a proud son of Henrietta, Texas. He is a graduate of Rice University. And then he, we don't like to talk about this, but then he went up to some pissant Yankee college. What? I've heard of that place. But Jim he has just retired, by the way, and I don't believe it, from a distinguished career at NC State, where he is now emeritus professor. So we are in for a real treat. And now how this is going to work, I think I'm going to let Bruce begin, and then Lee, and then Jim. And each one of them are going to speak for 15 minutes on their topic. 15, well, hang on. And my new friend Christina is going to keep the time. But guys, listen to me. I'm going to enforce the time. So when she holds up those paddles, you'd best mind. And then what we're going to do is when each of the people have had their 15 minutes, we're going to have a table discussion that's going to include all of you good folk. So don't wait to the Q&A session. Once we start the table discussion, if you have a question, be part of that discussion, because that's how this is set up. So I would invite you to join me in silencing your phones. They've got a little button right here on the side. And if you push that thing, you'll see red. And that will save you from embarrassment and our speakers from irritation. So if you do that for me, I would appreciate it. So without further ado, Bruce, why don't you come on up here and give us your 15 minutes. Yeah, I guess it is.
All right. Now, if you can't hear Steve, you're probably not going to hear me. So can you hear me in the back? All right. Because I have a notoriously low voice, but I will project into this thing. There's a button on here. Which one do I? Big green. Okay, that makes it easy. I've been at the Alamo going on 22 years, and there have been a lot of changes in the story of the Alamo. Part of it has to do with the 1986 Sesquicentennial. The story that was being told in 1986 is completely different from the story that's being told now. And part of that has to do with Dr. Hardin, Jim Crisp, Lee Spencer Witte, people who have been writing since that time. So the story really has changed. One of the things that our visitors sometimes don't understand is why there was a Battle of the Alamo at all. And we try to tell them the battle's really not over the Alamo, it's over the town. And the response that we routinely hear is, what town? And that's critically important because, as Andre was saying, battle after battle, fight after fight here in San Antonio. And it's because of the location. It's because San Antonio is an important place. Now, I have nothing against Dr. Brand, but I saw this on the internet. That's where we see everything nowadays. But it was him from a 1990s, I believe, or no, 2003, where he's talking about the Battle of the Alamo, essentially saying it's a military folly, didn't have to fight, they were stupid for doing it. Sometimes we have visitors that come here, and it goes back to that idea, are they fighting for the Alamo, or are they fighting for something bigger? You've also got, there's a lot of Houston fans who are writing. Houston says, you know, they should have followed my orders and they wouldn't have died. And that gets picked up. You get the John Wayne's movie. How many have seen the John Wayne's movie? You know, you get the idea from watching it, abandoned mission in the middle of nowhere. So why would you even fight over that if it's worthless? So I told them to leave. They get their own fate. Abandoned mission in the middle of nowhere. And what this does is if you start to look at the documents from that time period, you get a totally different picture of why they're there. Not they're there because they won't follow orders and just because they're stubborn, but because there's an important reason why they're there. Now, the Texas Revolution suffers from being oversimplified. You know, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. A lot of what's happening in the Texas Revolution is in between those events. And so it's the in-between that is sometimes more important. So San Antonio, why is San Antonio so important? It fills all these purposes. It's a seat of political power. It's a population center. Andres talked about the population rebuilding. So there are people there. It's an economic hub. It's a garrison town. It's a strategic crossroad. It's everything that makes a place important. Now, quickly, this is Revolution 101. Revolution breaks out. What do the rebels have to do? They've got to make a point. Often that point is we have to capture something important. What's something important? San Antonio. The government's response, we lost San Antonio, or we need to take it back. And as Andres was talking about the earlier event, rebels capture San Antonio, Arredondo comes and takes it back. This is a pattern that gets repeated over and over in the history of this region. And it's because San Antonio is an important place. Now, it's an important place because of its location. You can come here, you can find water, you can find plants, you can find all these things. You know, Comanches steal your horse, you get here, you report it. It's an important place. We have a skewed view of Texas because you can talk about Mier and Camargo, Laredo. They're not Texas yet. And so where is really the first place that you arrive when you come into Texas? San Antonio. Where's the last place when you're leaving Texas to go to Coahuila? San Antonio. So its location is extremely important because it's a frontier, it's a boundary. So, like I said, remember, when you think of the Texas Revolution, you have to your view of Texas has to telescope inward. Same thing. When you think of Texas, you have to, during 1824 to 1835 or 36, think of the state of Texas and Coahuila. Because those two are joined, their histories are joined. That's what makes it a bigger story. Now, we've all heard the adage about all roads leading to Rome. I don't want to be so arrogant as to say all roads lead to San Antonio, but if you look at this map, and we do this with visitors sometimes, we'll show them a map like this and say, what do you notice? You know, what do these lines represent? And eventually they'll get to the point where they go, oh, they're roads. Look at Behar and look at the roads that are coming there. So, again, very important crossroads. If you're traveling in this area, you come through Behar. Now, you can say, well, you can go around it. Well, you might be able to. But there aren't any roads. If there aren't any roads, can you carry supplies? If you need supplies, you have to find supplies along the road. So the idea of an army just setting off across country without any support of the roads, it's much more difficult to do than you would imagine. Now, frontier line strategy. If we had several hours, if y'all want to spend a couple hours, we can have a round table about the Texas Revolution, the strategy. But what happens is that at one point you get a group of people that say, we need to defend the frontier. And the frontier is defined by San Antonio, Goliad, and Copano. And it's not a World War I Maginot Line, I guess that would be World War II. But this is the line. They're going to have to pass, Santa Anna's going to have to pass this line to get into Texas. And down in blue, what I added is, this often gets overlooked. There isn't a large navy in Mexico, but the Texans have been very successful in combating the Texas Navy and denying them access to the coast. So the idea of, well, they could just land men and supplies on the coast, no, they've been denied that. And so they're going to have to come up the road to San Antonio or the road to Goliad. Now, Matamoros fever. Why are there not enough people at the Alamo when Santa Anna shows up? Has to do with the idea of Matamoros, that about half of the volunteers who have said that they're going to stay there and defend it get a better offer. And that offer is, let's go to Matamoros and we can capture the town. We'll have fun while we do it. You know, there's money there. It's going to be different. It's going to be exotic. It'll be a great time. Now, there's a reason to do that, and it's because you spread the revolution down further into Mexico. There are Mexican revolutionaries there that might help you. But Texas doesn't have the resources to defend the frontier, to go to Matamoros, or to retreat like get them confused sometimes. Sam Houston wants to withdraw to the east and rebuild the army, or essentially build the army. Oops. So this is James C. Neal announcing a big event, saying, the garrison we have, half of it's disappeared. And so he immediately, when this starts happening, this happens around right after Christmas in 35, starts writing the government and telling them about the situation. If you start looking at letters at that time, they know that the Mexican army is on the march. They already know that. This is from Bowie's famous letter where he talks about dying in these ditches. But what he talks about is San Antonio, and he calls it, it serves as the picket guard. Again, that idea, it's the trip line. We have to defend it because when Santa Anna gets here, it's going to set off an alarm. And essentially the idea is, we will be here. We've been calling for help. It's up to you all to get here. So this is William Barrett Travis. And what he says about it, the door for the invaders to enter the sacred territory of the colonies. So that's what he calls San Antonio. Next day, he reinforces that by saying it's more important, and it's the key to Texas. And remember when I said the Texas Navy had secured the coast? So that's what he's saying. It's the key to Texas, especially because they're not going to be able to come up the coast. I'm acknowledging that I saw that. All right, Houston. He says, I've told you to blow it up. But as Steve knows, what he says is, I sent him there to essentially with orders to blow it up if you think well of it. So it's not a positive order, but I'm having him do this if you're okay with it. And Governor Smith and the council are not okay with it. And so Governor Smith sends Travis. Both of them are urging money and men to get forward to San Antonio. And so when Travis calls for assistance, it's already been set up. We're here. You know we need you. When they get here, when the Mexican army gets here, we depend on you to get here fast. And again, if you look at all of Travis's letter, come to our aid. If you look at Robert M. Williamson, again, it's talking about, we're coming to your aid. We're coming. And why don't people get here? It's not that they're not on the way, it's that they don't have interstates. They can't text somebody and say, meet me somewhere. Time and transportation just are not in their favor. So, even Santa Anna, when he's writing his memoirs, what he says is San Antonio. It's important. He says it was necessary to open the door. So again, the idea of San Antonio being an important place and being the door to the colonies. He plans on refortifying it. He orders it destroyed. After San Jacinto, 1842, Mexican armies come back to San Antonio twice. So that's how important San Antonio is in this time period. And with that, I'll say my time's up. Thank you.
As Bruce was stepping up to the lectern, he said, "Is this my Warhol 15 minutes?" And I assured him that it was. But enough of that has-been wonders. Now we'll hear from Bruce again. Now, Lee, why don't you come on up and you get your 15 minutes of fame.
I'm not sure I'm going to speak the whole 15 minutes. I hope not. But when we were being raised, what did you hear about the Alamo? Who was the main characters? All you heard was Bowie, Crockett, Travis. What about the secondary characters in that story of the Alamo? There's almost 200 people inside the Alamo Fortress. Who are they? Where did they come from? What is their story? There's one young man that my co-author and I decided to sleuth his story a little bit, which was almost an impossible one, but through some serious footwork and some good luck, we were able to put a background to Joe, the slave who was inside the Alamo. Joe was 20 years old, and he was a manservant of the Alamo commanders, William Barrett Travis. We know a lot about what Joe reported to the Texas government through this man, William Fairfax Gray, who wrote the account in his diary. Let's see if I can. Joe describes the Alamo battle to the Texas government, what he sees. Of course, he's not a trained military person. He's a manservant. So we have to take into account what he sees in his interpretation of that. He tells the Texas government about the assault on the walls, how many times the ladders were brought up, they were repelled, and then when the Mexican army actually got over the walls, he described it as coming over like sheep over the wall. He describes the death of his master, William Barrett Travis. He describes where the bodies are located, and I'm assuming he sees those after the fact, because he says that when the Mexicans are upon them, William Barrett Travis yells at him to grab his gun and, come on, let's fight. So he does that until his leader, his commander, his master is struck. and falls in battle. And he retreats. He says after firing his rifle, and he says he fires it one more time, he's slightly wounded, and he is taken before Santa Anna and is in the city. He tells about what he saw in the city, and the amount of troops, which of course was probably very distorted. And he tells that there were several African Americans in the Alamo, and he says, he goes on to describe several of them, and I will talk a little bit about a few of them that we tried to figure out something about them. And of course, when you just have an African American in the Alamo, where do you go with that? It's kind of difficult. So you also go to old newspaper accounts and start looking at that. Is that primary? No, but it's something, because now we're sifting through all the minutia, all of looking for a clue anywhere, and following on some of those, which we do with a couple of the slaves in the Alamo. Joe sees something in the city of San Antonio. He's not sent out of the city of San Antonio to give a message. Susanna, the Anglo woman with the child, is sent back to the colonies, and Joe hides and meets her on the prairie. One thinks, what in the world did he see in San Antonio that was so horrible that he would choose slavery over going with the Mexican army? That has been a puzzle to me, and he never addresses that. So as we look at Joe and we look at his story, and all we've had up until now is this William Fairfax Gray's interpretation, and then we know that Joe kind of drops off the pages of history. Because what happens is Joe is brought back to the colonies. William Barrett Travis, of course, is dead, so his executor, John Rice Jones, the first Postmaster General for the Republic, is the executor of the William Barrett Travis estate. So, John Rice Jones does what executors should do, which is hire out Joe, try to make money for the estate, and he does that. Joe works for a man named Holtzclaw, who has a tavern in Washington on the Brazos. So, a short time after that, it's time to, again, settle the estate. What do? You need to settle your debts. So they have to sell off slaves. Joe's been through this before, and so he understands what's going to happen. And he takes his chance on April 21st, 1837, during the big celebrations of the victory at San Jacinto, to make his escape. And he makes his escape on the back of William Barrett Travis's horse. And John Rice Jones puts an ad in the paper saying, run away, and then silence. I don't know how hard John Rice Jones actually looked for Joe. I kind of question that. But because John Rice Jones also had an ill wife who died shortly after that. So there we are with nothing. He's gone. That's all history knows. And we start poking around and decide to just look at documents, go to the courthouses, find for ourselves. And so what we find is that we locate this document that shows that Joe was the property of Isaac Mansfield. And so after we found Isaac Mansfield, we started thinking, okay, that's sort of an unusual name. Let's start checking into that. And where's the logical place, or the first place you would check of where he might be from? Well, so many people came from Missouri. Let's check that one out. Well, doing that, we found, of all things, talk about good luck, we found that a document that mentioned Joe and Isaac Mansfield, because Isaac Mansfield being an unusual name, and it came up, of all places, in the writings of the first African-American novelist and a very world-traveled, well-known abolitionist named William Wells Brown. If any of you have studied anything about the abolitionists, you know that he was quite prominent. And he left a story of his childhood. And when we discovered that Joe is his half-brother, now all of a sudden you've got some new information on Alamo Garrison Defender. those things are rare to get any kind of a background on. And we just got a treasure trove of where he came from. He was born in Kentucky. He was taken as a young child to a small town outside of St. Louis by Dr. Young's family, and he lived happily there for many years until Dr. Young, too, got into financial difficulty, and he had to sell Joe and sell Joe's mother and sister, and his half-brother, William Wells Brown, ran away, went to Canada. So when we discovered this document, we were very excited, of course, and started looking into it, and went back and sort of retracked the paperwork of Isaac Mansfield, how he got to Texas, who was he. He was a tinsmith originally out of Connecticut, of all places, and he too was looking for a new start. So he thought, well, I'll buy these slaves, we'll get on a ship, we'll go down to Texas and get its new start. Well, he did that for a while until he got ill and died. And then, of course, a young attorney named William Barrett Travis was the attorney for his probate and his estate. And so, therefore, how does Joe get to the Alamo? Well, that's how. It's... Travis had a habit. He was actually a very good lawyer. A lot of people think he's not, but he really is. I started checking his background, all of the work he had. He's a great attorney. He's a probate estate attorney, and for a lot of the old families in Texas. But what he's doing is, as they sell off things, he's the first in line to see what's great to buy. Now, I just burned up the courthouses looking for the document, the actual link that I could prove that William Barrett Travis bought Joe. I couldn't find it. I could find this. And I said, what he's done is he doesn't want to show that he's a direct buyer. He's put somebody else in there to buy, and he's going to buy from them. I just know it. I come from Duval County, people. I don't know if you know it. That's how I find my information. Anyway, sure enough, guess who buys Joe from the Isaac Mansfield estate? We found the document. The future brother-in-law of William Barrett Travis, his last name is Cummings. William Barrett Travis is engaged to Rebecca Cummings, so her brother actually does the buying, and he buys from Cummings. That's how Joe gets to the Alamo. So in these secondary characters, again, not the big names, not the commanders, but they all have a story. They all have a part. Joe actually technically was an Alamo defender. He picked up a rifle, but he's also a survivor. So it's always been hard for me where to put him, in the Alamo Descendants Association. We have defenders, scouts, couriers, survivors. So we put him under the survivor group for quite some time. Here's another little issue. Joe mentions this black woman who was dead on the field, and Dr. Steve Hardin was the first one to mention this to me, but I had forgotten. It had been years ago that Kevin Young and Steve Hardin and I were at a restaurant. They have a terrible choice in restaurants. Don't ever eat out with them. They have this Tex-Mex Chinese place and Hung Fong. I don't do well with that. But I remember they would sit there and they talk about minutia of the Alamo. I was like, oh my God, people, get a life. Oh. And of course, I do it myself now. That's what's so bad. But Steve Hardin was saying, well, there's a Mexican report of a black woman dead on the field. I wonder who that was. And then they go on to another topic about Susanna or whatever. But I remember mentioning that. Well, during our course of sleuthing, we found a lawsuit against one of the Alamo defenders. There's an Ezekiel Hayes out of New Orleans who in 1831 sues Patrick Henry Herndon, an Alamo defender, saying that he ran off with his female slave, Sarah. And of course, dyed-in-the-wool romantic that I am, immediately I went, oh, that's her right there. There's no doubt in my mind that's her. Do I have actual proof? No, but the circumstantial was good enough for me. I thought, okay, what other black woman is going to be out there? Now, Joe said, well, maybe she ran out there. Well, who in their right mind is going to run out in a battle? You're going to huddle in a room somewhere. You're not going to be out near a cannon. unless you're helping your lover man that cannon. And I asked a military historian, I said, how many people does it take to man a cannon? And so they started talking, 3. And I said, well, okay, what is the minimum amount it takes to man a cannon? And they said, well, you can do it with 2, but it's difficult, but you can do it. I said, well, there's not enough defenders. Of course, it would make sense to me. I would use, whoever I had, my loved one there to help me too. So again, that romantic in me says, here's another little story about the Alamo. The secondary, it doesn't have anything to do with the battle, but to me it's important. The individual stories, the Tejano stories. Again, a lot of them in newspapers, a lot of them remembrances. But when you take 3 or 4 and they're all telling you the same story, they tell about the bodies being piled and burned and stacked with firewood and tallow to burn them for days. I believe that. We have enough reports where yes. Now, there's some that are a little more stretched, and a lot of people don't want to believe them. And I'm still seeking proof that some of these stories are real that we have in the newspapers. Some of the Tejano stories that I find interesting are in Dr. Tim Matavina's book, Tejanos Remembered, or it's Remembered Tejanos accounts. And it talks about those kind of things, like going to the priest's house, during the Battle of the Alamo, and the priest saying, no, step back away from the window and protecting them. Well, we have this one lady named Mrs. Yorba, who's actually in Tim's book, the first half of the stories in his book. And she's a woman from the Yucatan, happens to be in San Antonio at the wrong time. Her husband's gone. And so she also takes refuge inside the inside the priest's house. She goes on to tell the story of actually being asked to, along with the other women, to go to the Alamo itself and help the wounded Mexican and dying soldiers. And in her story, it gets gory and bloody and, tugs on the heart. And I'd like to be able to prove that. My next mission is going to be go to the Yucatan and prove who she is, and on over to California, where there's actually Yorba, California, and her family's people are from that area. So kind of interesting. Another one of those sleuthing missions. But again, going back to people like Joe, going back to the women and children in the Alamo, they too had a story. They had a part. And there, again, almost 200 people in the Alamo, but yet today, who do we remember? Bowie, Crockett, and Travis. And now we've got Esparza, so we'll pull him in. But you know what? We also have Ruiz Herrera, who supplied cattle for the Alamo. You have Lozoya. And there's another romantic story in the Alamo, which is about Miss Lozoya and Elio Melton. I don't know if they were engaged, living together, I'm not sure. But what I can tell you is that in later years, she claimed as his wife, but there's no proof of that. His brother actually made the claim. So I think it was just a love affair. But all these things are interesting to me and exciting for other people. And again, it shows that there's more to learn about the Alamo. There's more out there. If I can find it, my co-author can find it. Of course, like I said, we're dogged in it, but it can be found to get more information on the Alamo. And this is an image of Joe at Holt's Claws Tavern. And this is John Rice Jones hunting Joe. And this is part of one of the runaway ads. Oh, St. Louis. He spent much time sitting on the banks of the river and contemplating and actually viewing slaves going down the river. I encourage you to please not only remember the commanders of the Alamo, but remember all of the secondary characters. And again, it's not Bowie, Crockett, and Travis when you remember the Alamo. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Gordon would be proud. Jim Crisp has never been one to accept conventional wisdom. In fact, during the entirety of his career, Jim has been something of a myth buster. And a lot of people don't like to have their myths busted. Jim was standing on Alamo Plaza one day, minding his own business, and a lady he didn't know from Adam's house cat came up to him and said, "Are you Dr. Crisp?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she said, "I'd like to gut you with a Bowie knife." Now, it is a testament to Jim's generosity and good cheer that lady is now a good friend of his. And so that's a rare combination. So without further ado, Jim, regale us.
I ain't talking about the Alamo, except for one thing, and this is for our friends from Monterey. I published a book about the Alamo in Monterey in 2009, Confrontando el Alamo, la última lucha de Davy Crockett y otros mitos de la Revolución de Texas. Go read it, if you can. My talk today is going to be about what happened to the arc of the experience of the Tejanos following the Texas Revolution. It's going to sound more like topic sentences from a number of paragraphs because that's pretty much what it is. We don't have time to do anything else. Now, I assume that X that you hold up means I've got 10 more minutes in Roman numerals. Maybe not. There's a conventional wisdom that has been propagated by amateur historians like Jeff Long, by professional American historians like John McFarriger, by even professional good Texas historians like Paul Lack. And that is that the battle for Texas between Santa Anna and the rebels became a race war. A race war that by January and February of 1836 meant that there was no trust between the ethnic groups of Anglo-Texans and Hispanics. Now, it's true that the revolution created a lot of tension there. Tension that began as early as New Orleans in 1835 when my favorite Texan, Herman Ehrenberg, who left Texas forever, was signing up for the New Orleans Grays, and there was competition between the Mexican Federalists who wanted to free Mexico from the Centralists and those who wanted to gain Texan independence. They didn't trust each other even in October of 1835. But the distrust was greater as the revolution went on, but the alliance bent, but it didn't break. As I said in a paragraph I wrote recently, the Rebel Alliance was doing very well by Christmas of 1835, but pretty soon the Empire struck back. And what I want to just explain to you is that San Antonio was the most important part of this story. Unlike Las Vegas, what happened in San Antonio didn't stay in San Antonio. In a number of predominantly Hispanic towns of South Texas, Victoria, Old Goliad, La Bahia, to a certain extent in San Patricio. Yes, the revolution ended up pretty much destroying those towns or removing the Tejanos from those towns, such as even the patriotic De Leon family from Victoria. The two people who were most important in saving San Antonio, saving the people of San Antonio, and those are the words of Juan Lynn, the mayor of Victoria, the Irishman, were Sam Houston and Juan Seguin. Those two together were so important. Why? Because Juan Seguin came into San Antonio after Edward Dwyer and some of his fellow conspirators had said that what we got to do is put some Texas troops into San Antonio and then those people will sell cheap. But guess who rode in at the head of those Texas troops? Juan Nepomuceno Seguin, as the commandant of the garrison at San Antonio, as the head of the Texas Army in San Antonio. He wasn't head of the whole Texas Army. One person who liked to think he was a fellow named Felix Houston. No relation. He spelled it different. But Felix Houston sent an order to Juan Seguin, and what he said was, raise the place. That's not R-A-I-S-E, that's R-A-Z-E. Destroy San Antonio and move everyone there east of the Brazos. Not the Guadalupe or the Colorado, but east of the Brazos. So what does Juan Seguin do? He appeals to the president of the country, Sam Houston. And Sam Houston rescinds the order that Felix sent, says, I'm going to depend on you, Seguin. We don't have the letter that Seguin sent to Houston, but you can guess what it said, because Houston said, believe me, no one meant to impugn your honor. You are going to be my eyes and ears on the border, and you know well who our enemy is. And he's talking about the Mexican army. The order to destroy San Antonio comes in July of 1836. Houston's rescinding of that order comes in January of 37, and then later in 37, President Houston establishes, not only in the army but in the judiciary, control by Tejanos. He appoints, Erasmo Seguin as the chief judge of the district court in San Antonio of the Republic of Texas. So I've heard people say that, and Paul Lack actually said this, that the experience of Tejanos and Native Americans and African Americans were very similar following the Revolution. Absolutely, positively not. I've heard another historian say that, well, you know, why do we honor the Texas flag? Because they had slavery and they were hard on the Mexicans, and you know, if we don't like the Confederate flag, why do we like the Texas flag? Well, let me tell you something. No African Americans ever served as district judges in the Confederacy. No African Americans ever served as senators in the Congress of the Confederacy. No African Americans ever served as commandants of garrisons in the Confederacy. But all of those were true of Tejanos in the early Texas Republic. Things were getting better. In 1836, they created a district court law that said if you were an African, an Indian, or a descendant of an African, or a descendant of an Indian, then you couldn't testify against a white person in a Republic of Texas court. Really? Not even in Erasmo Seguin's court? They had trouble with that, and you know, by 1838, they passed another law rescinding the part that spoke of descendants of Indians. Because you can't make that kind of distinction work in a republic which is full of Tejanos in the military, in the judiciary, in the Congress, in the militias, in the ranger companies. That's what's going on. In 1838, the Houston Telegraph and Texas Register welcomed new Mexican immigrants coming into Texas from the Rio Grande and beyond, and establishing farms around San Antonio. In 1839, the Telegraph and Texas Register welcomed again Mexican immigrants to the Texas Republic. That's not the image that most of us had growing up about what was going on after the revolution in Texas. Even in 1838, when there was a rebellion of sorts in Nacogdoches, led by Vicente Cordoba, that Andres Tijerina mentioned before. It didn't make much of a splash. In fact, only one person was convicted of treason, was convicted of rebellion in that incident in Nacogdoches, and he was pardoned by President Lamar. There was confiscation of property, sure, but the Texas Republic treated that as a kind of a blip. Didn't respond very much at all. Things were still getting better by 1839, by 1840, when Juan Seguin is still on the district court here as chief judge. But as you've heard, the Mexican army came twice into San Antonio in 1842. The first time, Juan Seguin knew they were coming. He had business correspondence with General Vasquez. He knew Vasquez was coming. He warned the Texas government. He warned the San Antonio City Council. And when Vasquez came in, there was no one there to capture. And within 2 days, the Texas Rangers, led by Juan Seguin and John C. Hayes, were chasing the Mexican army back towards the Rio Grande. But a virus had been injected into San Antonio by Vasquez. And he said that, you know, that Seguin fella, he's the one who had us come in here. He's the one who told us about the Santa Fe expedition, and we're coming in because of your Santa Fe expedition. Well, do you really think that Juan Seguin is the person who told them about the Santa Fe expedition? It was in all the papers. Everyone knew about it. It wasn't Seguin. But Seguin's enemies, and people who wanted to take advantage of Seguin, who was by now mayor of San Antonio in his second term in 1842, having served as commandant of the garrison, senator from Bexar County. This man did not speak English. He and Houston spoke the same language, but it was the language of honor. They couldn't read each other's mail in English or Spanish. But Seguin was elected senator, and in his second and third years, what do you think his role in the Senate was? He was the chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. That's a very different Texas Republic from what we've been told about by a lot of historians who said that the Tejanos immediately suffered the same fate as others, especially the African Americans and Native Americans. But in 1842, when Seguin was forced out of office as mayor and then forced to flee to the Rio Grande, his friends were beaten up in his own house. The ranches around his own were burned. He was being shamed. And I'll leave you with this. What was so different between Texas in 1838, when Vicente Cordoba's rebellion was sloughed off? Another person, by the way, that Andres put up on the board was Carlos de la Garza. And I've learned from Carlos's own descendant, Alonso Salazar, a Texan today, that even though Carlos de la Garza was not a Texas patriot, he fought for the Centralists. He and his scouts are largely responsible for the success that General Urrea had coming up and wiping out so many Texans on their way towards the Brazos River from Matamoros. But after the revolution, Carlos de la Garza said, I ain't leaving. I'm staying right here at Carlos Rancho. And he became such a respected citizen of the Texas Republic, even after fighting on the other side, that the district court met at Carlos Rancho, the district court of the Republic of Texas. So things are not all going downhill, but then in 1842, there's this transition from patriot to pariah on the part of Juan Seguin. What's so different about Texas in 1842 and Texas in 1838, the year of the Cordoba Rebellion, that hardly made a wave? hardly made a ripple. As Andrew Torgett has suggested in his recent prize-winning book, Seeds of Empire, the Texas Republic was failing. The Texas Republic was a failed experiment. The Texas Republic was broke. The Texas Republic had been humiliated with the capture of the Santa Fe expedition. The Texas Army had been furloughed. The Navy was so damn expensive to build by President Lamar that he couldn't hire any sailors to man it, and so he rented it out to Yucatan for 8,000 silver dollars a month. The Texas Republic was in big trouble, and everyone knew it. Migration had stopped. Inflation was rampant. The treasury was empty. You couldn't get land anymore for just coming to Texas. Texas was in big trouble, and they were either going to have to turn to Uncle Sam or John Bull for help. And both the English John Bull and the American Uncle Sam knew it. And they were trading elbows a little bit about how they would get their hands on Texas. What happened was status anxiety on the part of Texas. And when you have status anxiety, you tend to blame people. You tend to look for scapegoats. And the scapegoats that were blamed after 1842 and after Seguin was forced to leave San Antonio. And as he said, I acted as a father and not as a citizen. And in order to save my life and save the life of my family, I agreed to come back to San Antonio with the Mexican army. Guess who came with him? Vicente Cordova. And he took 200 families from San Antonio who had been abused by the Texas soldiers who had come in after the Vasquez raid, and he took them back to Mexico. One last thing. Most people who knew what had happened to Juan Seguin, Sam Houston primary among them, knew what had happened to him. And after he had fought against Texas for years, after he had fought against the United States in the war with Mexico, Seguin was welcomed as an honorable person back here in San Antonio, where he became one of the founders of the Democratic Party in the 1850s, and even became a judge, I think, in Floresville. So Seguin was welcomed back. My ex over here says I have 10 minutes left, but I'm going to quit anyway.
Thank you, Jim, not only for those comments, but limiting it to 15 minutes. I know how difficult that was for you. Now, we're going to begin our roundtable discussion. Now, I assume those mics are hot. Would you test them? Okay.
Steve, since I quit early, can I mention Edward Dwyer?
Sure. Actually, you quit right on time. But yeah, you can mention Edward Dwyer.
The other name that Andres put up on the board was Edward Dwyer, and indeed he was conspiring to go in to San Antonio and buy land cheap if they could scare the Bejareños in 1836. But if you can't beat them, join them. And what he did by 1840 was to get onto the San Antonio City Council with the assistance of Juan Seguin. And then, after marrying into a Bejareño family, after marrying a Mexican woman in San Antonio, he became mayor of San Antonio in 1844. So Edward Dwyer changed his spots from someone trying to take advantage of the Bejareños to someone who became, by marriage, a Bejareño.
So much. I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege here. When you do what I do for a living, you acquire books. And I was cleaning out my library the other day, and I came across this one. It's called Historic San Antonio. Does anybody else know this book? Historic San Antonio?
By whom?
It's edited, Jim, by a guy. Yeah, well, it has a Robert Sternberg, and here it says copyright 1920.
Yeah, he's part of the Knights of Columbus, and that's what the Catholic Church. It was basically written in how do you say it, defense of the Catholic Church against the Roman Catholic Party.
Ah, very good. Good to know. Thank you. But I swear I have no idea how I came by this book. But it was fortuitous that I discovered it because I was reading something that I want to share with you. During the month of May, in the year of our Lord 1918, when San Antonio was filled with recruits, soldiers of the more or less finished type, the writer of this sketch was accosted by one of them. "Say, mister, how old is this burg?" "This year and month, San Antonio celebrates the 200th anniversary of its existence as a city." I admit that this reply sounded rather haughty and boastful, even to my own ears. I felt conscious that my facial expression registered civic pride in a marked degree. "Ah, cut out that talk," swiftly was flashed back at me. "What are you trying to give us? Why, there wasn't any U.S. 200 years ago. And how could you get on the map way out here where nobody lived? And if your burg is 200 years old, why ain't you people celebrating or something?" He and his several comrades gave me what might be described as the horse laugh and proceeded with their errand of taking in the burg. Well, he goes on to explain that in 1916, the good people of San Antonio had begun to make plans to celebrate the 200th anniversary of San Antonio, but what happened in April of 1917?
No war.
Yes, America entered the Great War. That's what they called it then. You can't have a World War I until you have a World War II. So it was the Great War in those days. And the editor goes on to explain that the people of San Antonio, they thought patriotism trumped civic pride, and it would be unseemly to celebrate while the nation was at war and young Americans were in harm's way. So the 200th anniversary was not observed in any major way, which I guess means we have to celebrate the 300th anniversary twice as much, because, you know, I just thought that was fascinating. It was so fortuitous that we found, and I would like to ask the other members of the panel to, why is it important that we mark these milestones?
I was once at Phillipsburg Manor, which is in the Hudson River Valley above New York City. And they had a map of the early colonial or post-colonial United States there. And once you got past the Appalachians, there was nothing. And they talked about, the founding of New York City and New Amsterdam and all that. I said, where the hell is Santa Fe? That's 1610. They were stunned to learn that there was anything out on that map besides desert and cactus. The people of the United States have a very limited knowledge of the Hispanic Southwest, and they need to be educated.
Yeah, even now. Yes, sir. If you'll speak up. I think the acoustics are pretty good, but you're going to need to.
How many stories
Lee?
Well, we know that there are close to 200 people inside the Alamo garrison, so I would say at least 200. And if you throw in a few affairs, etc., there might be some more.
I think it's what you define the Alamo as. If you're talking about the battle, then that would be an appropriate answer. If you're looking at 300 years, then that gives you a... Yes.
Olvidate.
And so I've been working on the mission period, stories that have just, the idea that 100 mission Indians from Valero would have to go rescue the soldiers at the Presidio in 1745. There are so many stories that they haven't, it's not exactly that they haven't been told, but you got to look for them. You've got to dig these things out. Now, the question about anniversaries, I think that there's a propensity to celebrate anniversaries because we want to celebrate who we are. We want to connect ourselves with the past. And so there's always a flurry of activity, even if it doesn't happen. The idea that we ought to do something, but we can't. What I have observed is that often there is, again, all this activity once the centennial, the bicentennial, the tricentennial, I guess quadricentennial, and we could go on, is that a lot of that is like, oh, well, we did it, and the passion more or less is spent. So I think the challenge is, talking about stories, is how do you make those stories last? How do you weave them into the narrative so they're not just fleeting?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the sesquicentennial back in '86. And frankly, I was kind of disappointed in how it could have been so much more, and it was pretty much a statewide beer bust. But one of the things that irritated me back in '86, you'd see bumper stickers that said, "Happy Birthday, Texas." I'm sorry, Texas wasn't born in 1836. It goes back a lot further than that, but it doesn't all begin at the Alamo. And believe me, guys, I think the Alamo is important. I've written books about it and all that stuff. But that's not where it begins. And even if the Alamo is all you're interested in, you can't understand the Alamo unless you understand what went before and what came after. And as someone who teaches Texas history for a living, I've often had cause to lament that my students remember the Alamo and forget everything else. And I think that is perhaps true of a lot of people who live in Texas today. And it's why gatherings such as this are so valuable. Yes, ma'am, way in the back. My God, Dora, is that you? I don't have my glasses on.
That is Dora Guerra.
Oh, Dora, okay. The wonderful Dora Guerra.
Navarro was gone when the manure hit the fan in the Texas Republic because he had been sent to Santa Fe as part of the Santa Fe expedition, and he was in a Mexican prison. One of the ironies was that the only Tejano who still seemed to be honored during those years between 42 and 45 was the one who wasn't there. But with he did that not only in the Texas Congress, but most importantly in the Constitutional Convention of 1845, where he fought the confiscatory aspects that some people, mainly Cunningham from Victoria. Victoria was a tragedy. The loyal Tejanos of Victoria were just run out, and a bunch of new-coming squatters took over. And Cunningham tried to put through a land confiscation policy in the Constitution of the state of Texas. Navarro was the only Tejano in that convention. In California, in 1850, there were 8 Californios. And even with all 8 of them trying to protect their rights, they got nailed by the newcomer squatters who had come to California.
So Seguin and Navarro never crossed paths?
Oh, sure. In the 1850s, after Seguin had come back, they both were giving speeches against the Know-Nothing American Party and supporting the Democratic Party. There was a newspaper that you ought to look at sometime called El Bejareño, which was a Democratic Party paper published here in San Antonio during the 1850s with speeches from both Navarro and Seguin. Let me ask you one question about San Antonio. Who knows what the ejido was? Ejido, E-J-I-D-O. It's common land held by the municipality. And what happened in all those other towns, especially like Victoria, that were taken over by newcomers, the guys who got themselves elected to the mayoralty and the city council took over the ejidos, sold them to themselves.
Still doing it.
What happened in San Antonio was that William Henry Dangerfield got elected mayor and William Houff got elected to the city council. And they tried to sell off the ejidos. But you know why they didn't? It's because they were outnumbered by the Tejano majority on the city council. And as soon as they failed to sell off the ejidos to themselves, they quit. They were politicians for one reason, and that was to steal from the people of San Antonio. And as soon as they were foiled in their plans to sell off the ejido to themselves and their buddies, they quit the city council. And for the rest of the Republic, San Antonio had a Tejano majority on the city council, even when the mayor was Anglo, like Smith, like Dwyer, and I've forgotten a couple of others. They were married. I'm sorry?
Maverick was one of them.
Yeah, no, Maverick was not married to a Tejana,
no.
but those other guys had married into Mexican families in San Antonio. And the Tejanos remained largely empowered throughout the Republic in San Antonio. That's even after 1842. Now there was a hiatus in which civil government almost disappeared after that terrible invasion. Remember what General Wall did in the fall that Vasquez couldn't do in the spring. He surprised them. You know why he surprised them? Because Juan Seguin wasn't around to warn them like he was in the spring. And when he surprised them, he captured the entire district court. The judges, congressmen, the lawyers, the prosecutors, and everybody. And then, in order to foster ethnic division, he only took the Anglos back to Mexico into prison and let all the Tejanos go. And there was reason behind that. He was trying to sow division in San Antonio. But 1842 is a terrible, terrible year for San Antonio.
Our time is quickly winding down, which I regret. We will be available to answer questions, but we really do need to bring this to a close now. Although I would like to mark something that I find rather ironic. Back in 2003, I was a historical advisor to the Touchstone movie, The Alamo, the one with Billy Bob Thornton, you know, the one that about 12 people saw. I told John Lee Hancock, the director, because in this movie, Juan Seguin is Houston's conscience. And I said, well, John, you know, Juan didn't speak English. And he said, well, yeah, but we want to pay homage to Juan Seguin. So they paid homage to Juan Seguin, all right, by having him speak a language that he never spoke. So sometimes the irony is when you want to pay homage to a person, you have to distort history to do it.
What a fabulous panel. We are so privileged to hear you all. We don't get a treat like this very often.